Emily received a message from her husband, John Smith, while waiting at his favorite restaurant.
Don't wait for me for dinner tonight. I won't be coming back.
Emily had been waiting for 2 hours and was reminded of their wedding anniversary that morning. Despite her reminders, John forgot.
Please serve the meal.
Mechanically, she ate alone, the food tasteless in her mouth. Her hand tightened as she cut the steak, the silver knife screeching against the white plate.
Hiss.
Her fingers recoiled slightly as the sharp knife tip cut her fingertip. Droplets of blood welled up, yet she felt no pain. She had never been good at eating Western food. John used to cut the steak for her.
What will I do when I can't eat steak with you anymore?
That won't happen. I'll always be here.
Pressing hard on the wound, Emily laughed at herself. Those were just empty words. Only a fool would believe them. As she put down the knife and fork and looked up, she saw John walking in from the entrance.
John!
Another familiar figure followed him inside. It was his long-lost ex-girlfriend, Alice Johnson. Alice was dressed in a well-fitted white suit, her baby fat mostly gone, her eyes sparkling. In front of John, she still looked like a little girl, just as she did back then. John had apparently reserved a table. After greeting the waiter, he waited for Alice to catch up, and they exchanged a knowing smile, their eyes filled with tender affection. Emily stared at them, and when it seemed like John was about to look her way, she guiltily turned her face towards the window. The night outside had grown even darker. Her heart pounded like a drum as she fled home, sitting in the dark living room, unable to calm down.
Alice Johnson had returned. So that's why John had been so distracted and elusive these days.
I had been married to John Smith for 4 years, but I had loved him for nearly 10. John Smith was 2 years ahead of me in school. During our university days, more than half of the girls openly or secretly liked him, and I was no exception.
Do you remember that day, John? When Alice shouted in front of the entire school.
John Smith nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips.
Yes, she was always so bold.
Alice was my roommate and my best friend at the time. She shouted those words while sitting right next to me. I watched her face flush with excitement and her eyes sparkle, and my heart sank as if weighed down by something heavy.
Alice knew better than anyone that I liked you, John. But she never told me she liked you too.
With her superior looks and lively personality, it didn't take her long to win over the campus heartthrob, John Smith.
Do you remember how I introduced her to everyone? This is my girlfriend, Alice, I would say.
What did it matter that I got the top score in the department to join John Smith's debate team? What did it matter that I won the best debater trophy for him? The person I had to work so hard to get close to was easily won over by Alice. There was a soft sound at the entrance. John Smith had returned. He tiptoed in, probably seeing me lying on the sofa, and draped a blanket over me. I opened my eyes and met his gaze. He was very close, his sharp features even more pronounced in the faint moonlight from outside. The unfamiliar scent of perfume on him made me feel nauseous.
Ugh!
I couldn't help but retch, probably because I had hurried home after dinner and my stomach was unsettled. Plus, the smell on him made me dizzy.
It's late, why aren't you sleeping in the bedroom?
He didn't seem to mind, his voice gentle as he reached out to rub my head, his warm fingers slowly sliding to my cheek.
Why are you back so late?
I ignored his slightly conciliatory touch, sitting up with a bit of irritation.
Are you mad?
He squatted in front of me, looking up at me, gently holding my hand and soothingly rubbing my fingers. His deep voice carried a hint of coaxing laughter. He knew this always worked on me, and sure enough, my anger dissipated in less than 3 seconds.
Do you know what day it is today?
My tone softened considerably, as expected. He magically produced a beautifully crafted velvet box from somewhere, likely containing the necklace I had always wanted to buy. He then turned and brought in a large bouquet of roses from the doorway, his body hidden behind the flowers.
Happy anniversary, Emily! I'm sorry, I was too busy tonight.
His tone was gentle, not mentioning Alice at all. He didn't bring her up, and neither did I. The old me would have been swept away by his tenderness and romance. But this time, I watched his impeccable performance with a detached eye, like an outsider. I had to admit, John Smith was a flawless, considerate, and romantic lover. But he didn't love me. Narrator, tone, sad, pressing hard on the wound. I laughed at myself. Those were just empty words, not to be taken seriously. Only a fool would believe them. As I put down the knife and fork and looked up, I saw John Smith walking in from the entrance. I was pleasantly surprised and prepared to call out to him. Another familiar figure followed him inside. It was his long-lost ex-girlfriend, Alice Johnson. Narrator, tone, serious. Alice was dressed in a well-fitted white suit, her baby fat mostly gone, her eyes sparkling. In front of John Smith, she still looked like a little girl, just as she did back then. John Smith had apparently reserved a table. After greeting the waiter, he waited for Alice to catch up, and they exchanged a knowing smile, their eyes filled with tender affection. I stared at them, and when it seemed like John Smith was about to look my way, I guiltily turned my face towards the window. The night outside had grown even darker. My heart pounded like a drum as I fled home, sitting in the dark living room, unable to calm down. Narrator, tone, whispering. Alice Johnson had returned. So that's why John Smith had been so distracted and elusive these days.
Sleep a bit more, I'll make breakfast.
He planted a kiss on my forehead as he got up. His attentiveness was unusually out of character. Since the day we got married, I had taken it upon myself to handle all the household chores. Back then, I believed there was nothing happier than cooking and cleaning for John. Even though I graduated from a prestigious university, top of my class, and received numerous job offers from well-known companies, I resolutely chose to work at John's company. My exceptional work abilities quickly shone through, and within just 6 months, I was promoted to a manager who could directly liaise with the company's top executives. To be close to him, I pushed my potential to the limit. Just when my career prospects seemed boundless, John faced several impeachments from the company's board. There was a mole in the company. The damage caused by this mole directly threatened John's position as CEO. The board gave him an ultimatum: find the mole within a week or step down. On the last night of the 1-week deadline, I saw John's most desolate figure standing by the floor-to-ceiling window in the darkened top floor of the company. I walked up to him, trying to appear relaxed, and patted his shoulder. He lowered his head and forced a smile, his eyes full of exhaustion. "Turn me in," I said, looking out at the bustling city lights with him.
What?
Was this situation hitting him so hard that he couldn't even think straight? I said, "I'm willing to be the one you turn over to the board as the mole, to buy you time to catch the real one. They want to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, using the mole as an excuse to shake your position. Your immediate task is to find someone, real or not, to take the fall. I have access to core operations, they won't suspect." He was silent for a long time, looking very conflicted.
How can I repay you?
"Marry me," I joked, grinning.
Okay.
Unexpectedly, John kept his word. The day he caught the real mole, he took me to get our marriage certificate. We didn't have a wedding, just the certificate. That night, I cautiously curled up into a ball and slowly snuggled into his arms. He chuckled and pulled me closer, resting his chin on my head. I heard him softly call me, wife. At that moment, something seemed to melt inside me, soft and warm. I guess my career is over, I murmured, my tone a mix of confidence and deliberate coquettishness. I traced circles on his chest with my fingertips. I knew my situation, with the label of a mole, no company would want me anymore.
I'll take care of you.
He said, grabbing my wandering hand and pulling me under the covers, his tone as light as that okay from before. I heard my heart pounding, deafeningly loud. That night, despite being sleepless, I felt enveloped in immense happiness, like walking on clouds, as if in a beautiful dream. When he married me, it had only been half a year since he broke up with Alice. Alice had cheated on him and had a quick marriage with a man her family introduced, then moved abroad. Half a world away, I once thought she would never return. Pressing hard on the wound, I laughed at myself. Those were just empty words, not to be taken seriously. Only a fool would believe them.
Looking up, oh, it's John Smith. And Alice Johnson.
Alice was dressed in a well-fitted white suit, her baby fat mostly gone, her eyes sparkling. In front of John Smith, she still looked like a little girl, just as she did back then. John Smith had apparently reserved a table. After greeting the waiter, he waited for Alice to catch up, and they exchanged a knowing smile, their eyes filled with tender affection.
Guiltily turning towards the window, I can't let him see me.
My heart pounded like a drum as I fled home, sitting in the dark living room, unable to calm down. Alice Johnson had returned. So that's why John Smith had been so distracted and elusive these days. A red SUV sped into the neighborhood and stopped downstairs at the building.
I remembered hearing before that Alice had a bold driving style, loved speeding, and had a preference for red cars.
Back then, people joked that Alice loved to drive on the edge of the law.
I've got someone to cover for me.
She would just smile, stick out her tongue, and snuggle into John's arms.
Even through the night and from the height of the building, I could clearly see John stumbling out of the passenger seat. John had a low tolerance for alcohol, a little drink would make him seem heavily intoxicated, so his assistants were always heavy drinkers.
Alice got out from the driver's seat to help him, but he seemed to avoid her, turning his head and asking her to leave. After a while, a blanket was draped over Sadie's shoulders.
Aren't you cold?
The smell of alcohol on John was strong, and his chest felt warm.
I turned to look at him, his eyes were slightly red but not sharp.
Crying?
His fingertip brushed the corner of her eye, his expression more serious than before, and his arm wrapped around her tighter. The dim bedside lamp cast flickering shadows on his face.
I turned my face away, not wanting to look at him, trying to break free, but he wouldn't let go. Let's get a divorce, John.
A faint smile tugged at her lips.
If you make a wrong choice, you start over. It's time to start over.
These words had the desired effect. As soon as she finished speaking, John let go of her in a daze.
I used to fear hearing those two words from him, but unexpectedly, I was the first to say them.
What?
His face stiffened.
I don't want to live this kind of life anymore. I said let's get a divorce.
Her smile grew wider.
Having said it once, saying it a second time brought an unexpected sense of relief.
I won't let you say such things.
His kiss came at that moment, filled with unreasonable dominance and intense possessiveness. He held her tightly, as if trying to merge her into his body, kissing her all the way to the bed, not letting go despite her struggles.
I'll take you home. We'll have a wedding. Don't leave me, okay?
What forced Sadie to escape was the overwhelming nausea. She broke free from his embrace and rushed to the bathroom, hugging the toilet and dry heaving, as if trying to vomit out her insides.
It turned out John had made me this sick.
Pressing hard on the wound, I laughed at myself. Those were just empty words, not to be taken seriously. Only a fool would believe them. As I put down the knife and fork and looked up, I saw John Smith walking in from the entrance. I was pleasantly surprised and prepared to call out to him. Another familiar figure followed him inside. It was his long-lost ex-girlfriend, Alice Johnson. Alice was dressed in a well-fitted white suit, her baby fat mostly gone, her eyes sparkling. In front of John Smith, she still looked like a little girl, just as she did back then.
Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?
Yes, I do. 4-2.
John Smith had apparently reserved a table. After greeting the waiter, he waited for Alice to catch up, and they exchanged a knowing smile, their eyes filled with tender affection. I stared at them, and when it seemed like John Smith was about to look my way, I guiltily turned my face towards the window. The night outside had grown even darker. My heart pounded like a drum as I fled home, sitting in the dark living room, unable to calm down. Alice Johnson had returned. So that's why John Smith had been so distracted and elusive these days. John seemed overjoyed about my pregnancy, acting like a happy fool every day. He even slacked off at work quite a bit.
Did you sleep well?
As soon as I opened my eyes in the morning, I found him watching me. Avoiding his gaze, he seriously reached under the blanket to hold my hand. The feeling between my fingers was strange. I extended my hand, and there was a hard, dazzling ring on my ring finger, surrounded by tiny diamonds, with a large diamond in the center. When did he put a diamond ring on me while I was asleep?
My wife looks beautiful with diamonds.
He held me gently, careful not to touch my belly, his voice tender and soft.
Get up! We're going to look at wedding dresses!
His voice filled my ears, making them itch. But my heart remained unmoved.
Aren't you going to work?
Isn't being with you more important than work?
He had chosen a unique bridal shop. I looked at the luxurious palace-like decor of the shop, letting them measure me and discuss the details of the wedding dress. Then I heard the designer mention an astonishing 7-figure price for a custom-made wedding dress. John didn't even blink and paid the money.
Are you burning money?
I want to give you the best.
I knew he didn't want to give it to me, he wanted to give it to his child. He didn't want his child's mother to be an insignificant woman without a proper status.
Come home with me this weekend to meet my parents.
I didn't say anything.
I bought tickets to Emily Brown's place. I'll pick up Grandma Rose tomorrow.
Mentioning Grandma Rose made my nose tingle with emotion. When I got married, I specifically went to Emily Brown's place to tell Grandma Rose because I needed to get the household registration book from her. She was the only one I could tell. She must have wondered why I said I was getting married but didn't mention a wedding, and she had never even met her granddaughter's husband. But she still hugged me and cried.
My dear, you will be very happy.
Pressing hard on the wound, I laughed at myself. Those were just empty words, not to be taken seriously. Only a fool would believe them. As I put down the knife and fork and looked up, I saw John Smith walking in from the entrance. I was pleasantly surprised and prepared to call out to him. Another familiar figure followed him inside. It was his long-lost ex-girlfriend, Alice Johnson. Alice was dressed in a well-fitted white suit, her baby fat mostly gone, her eyes sparkling. In front of John Smith, she still looked like a little girl, just as she did back then. John Smith had apparently reserved a table. After greeting the waiter, he waited for Alice to catch up, and they exchanged a knowing smile, their eyes filled with tender affection. I stared at them, and when it seemed like John Smith was about to look my way, I guiltily turned my face towards the window. The night outside had grown even darker. My heart pounded like a drum as I fled home, sitting in the dark living room, unable to calm down. Alice Johnson had returned. So that's why John Smith had been so distracted and elusive these days. They said Alice Johnson drove recklessly. They said Alice loved the color red. They said Alice liked to push the limits when driving. But why was it that everything Alice liked ended up costing me and the innocent life I carried? I lay in the ICU for 3 days before I was out of danger. When I woke up, for several days, I was like a mute, motionless doll, staring blankly at the ceiling.
Honey, please move, don't scare me.
John Smith held my hand, his knuckles white, trembling. His tears fell on my hand, both hot and cold.
We'll sue her, we'll send her to prison, okay?
His voice shook. I knew who he was talking about. She was his precious darling. Wasn't her reckless behavior a result of his indulgence? Even if she was punished, would it bring my child back? Even if she paid with her life, would it be enough? I moved my lips.
Leave.
John didn't move, panic and helplessness spreading across his face. I shifted my vacant gaze to him.
Leave.
Grandma Rose entered the room at that moment, her face already streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. She stumbled a few steps as she came in. Seeing her, it felt like a dead tree was burning in my chest, and a tear slipped down my cheek. Grandma hadn't known about my situation. John had hidden it well, telling Grandma we were on a trip. But today, Alice's lawyer had come to discuss compensation with my family. Grandma was the only one home, and she fainted after hearing just the first part. Grandma had a severe heart condition. Every time we went for her checkup, the doctor would repeatedly warn me to be extremely careful. But I was the one she worried about the most. Grandma was brought to the hospital by ambulance, but after waking up, she insisted on seeing me. She disregarded her own health to take care of me. I was truly unfilial. Grandma Rose and John Smith stayed by my side constantly, but a few days after I was discharged from the hospital, Grandma Rose fell ill and was admitted to the hospital. On the first night in the hospital, they issued a critical condition notice. I was at a loss, only able to shed tears, while John Smith remained calm, running around to handle everything.
It will be okay, it will be okay. Grandma Rose is blessed, she will be fine.
During the last resuscitation attempt, I waited outside the operating room, my nerves stretched tight, while John Smith held my hand tightly. The surgery lasted all morning, and finally, the doctor came out of the operating room, shaking his head helplessly. I rushed up, grabbing his arm and pleading through my tears.
Doctor, please save my grandma, please.
I'm sorry, my condolences.
I collapsed to the ground, and John Smith held me tightly, his eyes red, his voice choked with emotion as he tried to comfort me. Through the door of the operating room, I looked at Grandma Rose lying quietly inside. The room was dimly lit with a faint blue light, and my heart ached with a dull yet excruciating pain. The doctor allowed us to put on sterile gowns and enter the operating room to see Grandma Rose one last time. I reached out to touch her face. It was no longer warm.
Grandma, look at me. Please, look at me.
I cried my heart out. Grandma Rose was gone. I was complicit. Following the instructions, I mechanically handled Grandma Rose's posthumous affairs, obtained the death certificate, and contacted the funeral home. I felt like a ghost walking in a vacuum, unable to feel the air, hear sounds, or sense emotions. After everything was over, I lay on Grandma Rose's bed, tears streaming down my face.
Just cry if you want to.
John Smith came in and leaned down to hold me. A sudden, inexplicable anger surged within me, and I sat up, slapping him hard. He didn't dodge. Instead, he held my hand, his gaze still gentle as he softly said,
It doesn't hurt.
It didn't hurt him. But it hurt me so much. After Grandma Rose's funeral, I firmly refused to privately negotiate compensation with Alice Johnson. In court, she insisted it wasn't intentional, just a momentary lapse. But because it resulted in actual harm, Alice Johnson was sentenced to 2 years in prison. As we left the courtroom, I calmly faced John Smith.
It's time we talked about us.
About what?
His expression was weary. He knew exactly what I was going to say.
Let's get a divorce. This isn't good for either of us.
He hung his head in defeat, silent for a moment. When he looked up again, his eyes were filled with tears. But he still forced a smile and softly said,
Okay.
Just like when he agreed to marry me. After parting ways with John Smith, I thought I would go through a period of immense heartbreak and sorrow, but surprisingly, I didn't. I started looking for a job as if nothing had happened. However, my past romantic inclinations still caused me a lot of trouble. No problem, if no company would hire me, I would start my own business. From the beginning, my company seemed to be blessed with a constant stream of clients, and the employees I hired were all exceptionally talented. Without facing many obstacles, the company doubled in size within a year. By the 3rd year, the company went public. On the day of the IPO, the entire company celebrated. After a few rounds of drinks, I found out that all my clients and employees were arranged by John Smith.
Do you really think so little of me?
That day, I had just secured a big contract, and the client was none other than John Smith. Seeing him, I sincerely asked the question that had been buried in my heart for a long time.
I believed you wouldn't let me down, that's why I helped you. And see, I wasn't wrong.
He sat across from me, impeccably dressed, with his long legs crossed. Time had passed, but he had hardly changed. That night, we went to a business dinner, and John, who usually didn't drink, got himself thoroughly drunk and ended up leaning into my arms.
Is John also into those unspoken rules?
I smiled faintly, straightened him up, and moved a bit farther away.
Is Michael still single?
I casually grabbed the hand of a young man nearby and waved it in front of him.
My personal matters are none of your concern, John.
The young man's eyes widened, and I could feel him holding his breath slightly beside me.
Ha!
John turned his head and laughed disdainfully. After a few more rounds, I got up to get some fresh air on the rooftop. As soon as I pushed open the rooftop door, a cold wind hit my neck, instantly sobering me up a bit. Behind me, I heard the heavy iron door being pushed open and familiar footsteps. My heart rate quickened. I reflexively turned around and met John Smith's gaze, his eyes full of sparks, ready to ignite the ambiguous night.
Did that boy's hand feel good?
Very good.
I laughed. John stepped closer until he grabbed my wrist. The warmth of his hand seeped through my skin.
Come back.
I laughed freely, as if hearing something amusing. I shook off his hand and walked past him. John Smith and we had only drifted apart, never to reunite. Narrator, tone, serious. Emily Brown liked me, I knew it from the beginning. In school, whenever she saw me, her eyes would dart away, her face would turn red, and she would stutter.
John Smith, tone, thoughtful. She probably thought she hid it well, but little did she know, she left plenty of clues. John Smith, tone, reflective. But when did I start liking her? I couldn't say for sure. I had to admit, she was an exceptional girl. Excellent grades, beautiful looks. The debate team wouldn't have been so invincible without her. Despite being so brilliant, she never sought attention, always staying humble and composed. It was rare to see someone who tried to hide their brilliance, and it intrigued me. She was the first person I had ever met like that.
I remember when Emily first joined the debate team, boys would come to my dorm asking about her. One even offered to get my meals for a month in exchange for her contact information, but I never gave in.
John Smith, tone, confused. I didn't know why I did that. Someone once asked me if I liked Emily. I denied it, but my heart was uncertain.
While I was contemplating my feelings, the girl who filled my eyes, Alice Johnson, appeared. Alice was passionate and direct. Vibrant and dazzling. She was like a little fireball running towards me on a winter day, impossible to resist.
John Smith, tone, serious. Alice was very jealous of Emily. She was generous with others but always jealous of Emily. And during my time with Alice, I could feel Emily distancing herself. She even changed how she addressed me, from senior to captain. John Smith, tone, regretful. Every time I wanted to take care of this girl who loved to hide in the corner, I found she had moved too far away for me to reach.
As I planned my future with Alice, she cried and told me she was getting married, but not to me. She trembled in my arms, crying her heart out, apologizing countless times.
John Smith, tone, resigned. Though I didn't say anything, I must have forgiven her. Alice left, leaving a huge void in my heart, shattering my future. It didn't matter who I married. John Smith, tone, reflective. Emily was probably the unexpected part of my broken future. When Emily jokingly said I should marry her, I turned to see her taking a cautious deep breath, her ears already red, and her tightly clenched fists showing no sign of ease. Her eyes shone with a delicate light in the darkness, like a little cat observing and waiting for the right moment. John Smith, tone, serious. She was too good. I didn't want her to be just anyone. But I didn't hesitate much, I almost immediately agreed. I urgently needed her help. Marrying her was almost a natural progression. What could have been a joke, I wanted to fulfill as a promise. John Smith, tone, hopeful. Much later, I realized that when she said, "Marry me," I had already quickly and thoroughly considered it, discarding all other thoughts, determined to make her my wife.
Narrator, tone, serious. On our first night together, she curled up in my arms like a soft marshmallow.
John Smith, tone, whispering. Is it okay without a wedding?